Hey everybody, we are back again with now our fourth video, I think. We're a new channel, so we really appreciate the support, and I'll get into that in just a second. But first, the topic for the day is the 5 most erroneous things that Bart Ehrman has ever claimed. Now, right away, I want to preface this because I know that Bart Ehrman has a lot of fans out there. There's a lot of folks who really love Bart Ehrman. I've heard him lecture a lot. I really like a lot of things that he said. In fact, I was much more of a fan of Bart Ehrman's lectures, his ideas, his theses, before I started realizing that there are some holes in some of the things that he says. And frankly, I got to the point where I realized that he does say a lot of things that are statements that he makes very authoritatively, as though they are historically flat facts that just are simply not true. I think if you can just watch this video from a neutral perspective, and reserve judgment for just a little while at least, I think you'll come to the conclusion that at least some of what Bart Ehrman says is not academically rigorous or not truthfully scrupulous, at least in the context where he says certain things. All right, so before we get into that, just a really quick plug for the channel. Thanks so much for liking the channel. Don't forget to subscribe. If you see something that you like, please click the bell icon for notifications. Please like this video. And if you find something that you like, please share it on any of your socials. We'd really love that. Since we're a new channel, that does make a huge difference for us. And maybe most importantly, please do keep the comments coming. Even if you're putting in a comment that you think I might not agree with, a lot of times I've looked into the things that you all have said on my previous videos, and I've learned a lot. I've been intellectually enriched by your comments, and quite a few times now already I've changed my mind about some of the things that I've said. So I really appreciate the comments. I really hope that you'll keep the conversation going in the comment section. All right, so now let's jump right into it. And like a lot of YouTube videos, we're going to start with the last claim first for some reason. So here is claim number 5 of Bart Ehrman's most erroneous claims. All right, so here it is. Claim number 5. The experiences of the disciples can be explained by post-bereavement hallucinations. Now, this is a claim that Bart Ehrman's made several times. He makes it in his textbooks, he makes it in his lectures, in his Q&As. So he has said several times that the experiences of the disciples can be explained by post-bereavement hallucinations. Now, this isn't just a casual throwaway comment. It's really built into his theories in a lot of different ways. It's an important causal link in how he explains the events in first century Judea. So it's a really important idea to his theories, and if you lose this causal link, then a lot of his analysis gets weaker. So it's an important statement that he makes, and he makes it as very fundamental to his ideas. Now, I promise, regardless of what you think of Bart Ehrman, the more you look into this, the more you'll realize that post-bereavement hallucinations cannot explain the experiences of the disciples. There's a lot of reasons I can be really definitive about this because I've done a lot of research. I'll first put a few statements from Bart Ehrman on the screen. These are statements that Bart Ehrman has made that support that what the disciples experienced was explained by post-bereavement hallucinations. So here are just a couple of quotes from Bart Ehrman on the screen right now explaining that. Now, there's a reason why I can be so definitive when I say that no, this does not make sense. Post-bereavement hallucinations cannot explain the experiences of the disciples. And that is because definitionally, the definition of what a hallucination is a sensory experience without an external stimulus to explain that experience. That's what a hallucination is. So that's different than a delusion. A delusion is a fixed false belief. So post-bereavement hallucinations can happen, but they don't lead to delusions. That's not something that's in the literature. Now, they can sometimes, but not without an underlying organic psychosis. So the only thing that would explain post-bereavement hallucinations and a delusion of Jesus being resurrected or a belief that he had apparently been resurrected would be if the disciples not only had the hallucinations, but also had an underlying organic psychosis. Now, I'll put for your own research, I'll put a few sources on the screen that are different references where you can read more about post-bereavement hallucinations. But all of these references show that these are experiences that are hallucinations. They don't result in delusions. Now, I've actually talked to people who have post-bereavement hallucinations, and it's not that uncommon for somebody to get the feeling like their spouse is still there. So that is something that happens, and that meets the definition, the criteria of a post-bereavement hallucination. But none of these people who say this ever believe that, yes, my spouse, my significant other, actually resurrected from the dead, and they were literally in a post-resurrected appearance. They had died and they came back to life, and I interacted with the resurrected version of my spouse. Nobody says that. That would be a totally different category. That would be in the category of a delusion. So post-bereavement hallucinations do not explain the disciples' experiences by definition. All right, now second, if you actually dive into the literature on this, post-bereavement hallucinations are a very different category of experiences overall. Now, it's important to note that an actual visual hallucination and a post-bereavement hallucination is not super common. So most of these references cite that the frequency of post-bereavement hallucinations is between 30 and 60%. But a lot of the experiences that are included in this are like a vivid dream, or a sensation that your loved one is still in the room with you, or just sort of a very brief visual experience where you see something and you think, well, that I feel like that was my loved one. Most of those visual hallucinations are actually hypnagogic or hypnopompic. So those are hallucinations that you have when you're either going to sleep or when you're immediately waking up. So when you're kind of in that dream state, so that explains a lot of the visual hallucinations. Now, moreover, as you dive into this literature, it becomes immediately apparent that the vast majority of post-bereavement hallucinations happen with someone who's lost a spouse, right? So they don't really happen in the setting of someone who's lost a friend. It's not unheard of, but it's certainly not very widely studied because it's so extremely uncommon. Now, moreover, if you read the New Testament and you believe in the pre-Pauline creed of, I think it's 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, and I'll put that on the screen right now. If you read this creed and you believe in it, then hallucinations should not really explain the experience because it says that Jesus appeared to a group of people. Now, but even if you don't believe this, just read the literature about post-bereavement hallucinations. It's never been published anywhere in the literature that people have had a post-bereavement hallucination about their teacher, right? So that's very uncommon. About a friend that they had a subordinate relationship, like so a pastor. No one's ever had a post-bereavement hallucination about a pastor or a religious leader. And again, post-bereavement hallucinations don't result in a new theology. So again, if you just read the literature, there's no way that this makes sense. Now, my problem isn't that Bart Ehrman just sort of said this as a throwaway statement, but again, it's really integral to the arguments that he makes. Moreover, and this is kind of the biggest thing, he put this argument in a textbook. Maybe even worse than this is he put it in a textbook, and it's a statement about psychiatry or psychology, something that Bart Ehrman knows nothing about. He's not an authority on this. In fact, no psychologist, no psychiatrist ever in history has made the case that the experience of the disciples can be explained by post-bereavement hallucinations. Now, if Bart Ehrman wanted to make that case, all he would have to do is put out an article with kind of a multidisciplinary perspective behind that article and get a psychologist, get a psychiatrist to be a co-author on that article and then put it out in the psychiatry literature or the psychology literature. But he doesn't do this. He just makes the argument from his own perspective. And then he to support his own argument, he kind of makes an appeal to his own authority. Now, this is really problematic because it's not academically rigorous. And it's hard to imagine someone justifying putting this thing that doesn't make any sense at all from a medical perspective into a textbook. It actually, when I first heard Bart Ehrman make this argument, knowing something about the difference between hallucinations and delusions myself, I said, wait a second, this does not make any sense. And for me, actually, as a big fan of Bart Ehrman myself at the time, this was kind of the first chink in the armor of his logic that I said, wait a second, at least some of the things that he says aren't academically rigorous, or aren't intellectually scrupulous. Now, if Bart Ehrman wants to make a claim like this, I think he could have done it in a very different way. He could have said, this is not my wheelhouse, this is not my field of expertise, but this is what I think can happen. But even then, those statements should be much more thoroughly vetted. Unfortunately, this is now a claim that's out in the literature, it's in a textbook, and I've heard this claim made by a lot of people. So this claim has gotten really circulated and really amplified because Bart Ehrman said it initially. So that's at the very least, very problematic. All right, okay, here's claim number 4. Okay, claim number 4. There are hundreds of thousands of errors in the New Testament. Now, this is a statement that I've heard Bart Ehrman make several times. He's used different words for the errors or the mistakes or discrepancies, depending on the setting. So errors, mistakes, discrepancies. The best word for this is variance, and I'm going to talk about why this makes a significant difference. Now, again, when Bart Ehrman makes this statement, he makes this claim, he does it with a lot of authority, saying these are discrepancies, these are things that should make us doubt the source document. And initially, when I watched Bart Ehrman talk about these topics, this was a very compelling factoid to me. It was certainly very compelling. But later on, when I dove into it, I realized that it's a bit of an overstatement for the following reason. There's a difference between a variant and a discrepancy. So let me just clarify that in Koine Greek, which is the language in which the New Testament was originally written, there are thousands of different ways of saying the same thing. If you look at Mandarin or English, Mandarin has fewer ways of saying the same thing. English has sort of more ways of saying the same thing. And Koine Greek has even more ways of saying the same thing. So if you look at a statement like, I went to the library last Tuesday to study, there are a lot of different ways of saying that statement in Koine Greek. In fact, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of ways to say the exact same thing. So there are variants. I've seen a lot of different statistics about how many variants are definitionally different in the New Testament. And it comes out to only maybe a dozen or maybe a few dozen, depending on the source that you read. But it's definitely less than 1%, and some people argue that it's in fact less than 0.1%. So now that creates a very different complexion for the statement that Bart Ehrman makes. And I just feel like it would be so much more scrupulous, so much more intellectually honest, to, especially if you're speaking to a group of people who are in the lay public, if you portray the data in a more honest way and just say, there are a lot of different variants, these aren't necessarily discrepancies, they don't change the definition. But here's in fact a couple of quotes from Bart Ehrman where he says that there's a huge amount of variance. And here's a quote from Bruce Metzger, who actually wrote an appendix to one of Bart Ehrman's books, and I'll put that on the screen right now. And as Bruce Metzger points out, none of the variants in the New Testament actually change Christian theology to any significant degree. Now, I think that's just a really important detail to include. And let me give you an explanation of why this is significant by way of analogy. Let's say I have a conversation with my girlfriend, and my girlfriend says, I think you cheated on me. Where were you last Wednesday? And I say, last Wednesday, I went to an appointment in my doctor's office. Now, let's say we have this conversation later in the week, and she asks me again, where'd you go last Wednesday? And I say, on Wednesday, I went to my doctor's office. I had an appointment. She's not going to say, well, wait a second, that's a discrepancy. No, she's going to say, well, you said the exact same thing. You're just saying it in a different word order. So most people would not consider that to be a discrepancy. It's a variant. It's just a slightly different way of saying the same thing. Now, for what it's worth, I think that the point that Bart Ehrman makes is convincing in regards to biblical inerrancy. And that's the doctrine that the Bible is the flawless, perfect, divine word of God. I don't personally believe in that doctrine, but to me, it was really an indictment of the New Testament in a more broad way to hear Bart Ehrman say, yes, there are hundreds of thousands of errors, hundreds of thousands of mistakes, hundreds of thousands of discrepancies in the New Testament. It sounded very convincing, and then when I looked further into it, I was like, wait a second, that's not really transparent and honest description of what's actually happening here. All right, claim number 3, there was never a tomb of Jesus. So Jesus was never buried, he was never placed in a tomb, and the body was simply discarded. So again, when I initially absorbed Bart Ehrman's lectures, I thought, well, this is a big indictment of the whole New Testament. We don't really have any documentation that the body was buried, that it was placed in a tomb. Probably the body was discarded. Now, when Bart Ehrman says this, again, he's saying it as though it's a flat fact. So he's saying this is just the way it is. The body of Jesus was discarded. And again, when I dove into the literature more, because I did listen to Bart Ehrman's lectures before I read anything in the New Testament. When I dove into this information more, I realized that at the very least, that's not a universally agreed upon take. So it's presented as an authoritative, flat fact, when in fact it's not. Let me just give you some quotes from Bart Ehrman again saying that the body was discarded. And again, this is a big part of Bart Ehrman's analysis. This isn't a passing comment. It's a big part of how he makes sense of history in first century Judea. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that there was a tomb and that the body of Jesus was stolen. We have a lot of arguments very early on in the Jewish response to early Christianity, in the Jewish response and literature about Jesus, that suggests that there was a tomb and the body of Jesus was stolen. There are a lot of different sources for this. Maybe one of the earliest is the dialogue between Justin and Trypho, I think is the name. This is written in 155 AD. Now, this was written from the perspective of a Christian apologist. But on the other hand, most historians do think that this accurately captured the Jewish response to Jesus. So now in this dialogue, Trypho makes the argument that the body of Jesus was probably stolen. This argument gained a lot of traction. It was repeated by many folks. It was probably very widespread as a response. It was repeated by Celsus. I'll put a quote from Celsus on the screen where he says that yes, the body of Jesus was probably stolen. It was repeated numerous times in other sources from early Judaism. I'll put some of those sources on screen. At least one of those sources is the Toledot Yeshu. Now, we have only medieval copies left of the Toledot Yeshu, but we think that the original copies were probably written in the 4th century, so fairly early on, and those original copies were probably based on early oral teachings. And now I've read 8 different versions of the Toledot Yeshu, and all 8 versions say that the body of Jesus was stolen. So to say that Jesus never had a tomb, he was never buried, the body was just discarded, that argument doesn't really gain traction until the earliest mention of that argument that I could find was actually in the 1990s. So I'm not saying that that's not what happened, but if Bart Ehrman wants to make that claim, then he should do it with more analysis. Instead, he just sort of makes the claim as an appeal to authority and as an appeal to his own authority. So I think this is a really problematic claim to make without really considering a lot of the evidence. I'll put some quotes on the screen from the Toledot Yeshu because they all have the exact same narrative, which to me is very convincing that this is a very early Jewish response. Now, I'll just briefly sort of preempt some of the arguments that people have against the Toledot Yeshu. One of the arguments that I frequently hear is that it's a medieval text. Now, we mostly have medieval copies of the Toledot Yeshu, but again, it was written much earlier than that. The oral tradition goes back as far as we can find. Another response that I often hear is the Toledot Yeshu was written in response to early Christianity and not really in response to Jesus. Now, that's an argument to be made, but I think there's a lot of evidence against that argument. And again, if that's an argument that people want to consider, it should be supported with evidence. Here's why I don't think that's true. Because in the Toledot Yeshu, there's very exculpatory language towards Paul. So it tends to excuse the actions of Paul. And it says that Paul was a good guy, Paul was fine, and refers to him as Saul of Tarsus, but that Jesus actually corrupted Paul. So this narrative goes along with the fact that the Toledot Yeshu was probably a response to Jesus directly and not as much a response to early Christianity. But regardless of what you believe, it's another set of arguments that says that the body of Jesus was stolen. I'm not saying that Bart Ehrman was frankly wrong, but I just wish he would portray the analysis as more mixed, more broad, and definitely not portray it as a flat fact that the body of Jesus was definitely discarded. Before we close out this argument, I'll put some other arguments on the screen, because we have some statements from Josephus saying that, that it was the custom of the Jews to bury people after they were crucified, even if you're a criminal, it's very important to put those bodies in the ground, give them a proper burial. We have statements from Deuteronomy saying that it was the Jewish custom. It was very much an error to not bury bodies. So here's a statement from Deuteronomy that sort of underscores that. We have other Jewish tradition that says that the body of people should be buried after crucifixion. There's also, we found a body, Yohanan ben Hagkol, I may be mispronouncing that, but here's a first century Jew who was crucified, who was then buried after crucifixion. So we know that at the very least, that's something that did happen sometimes. Now, this is not something that the Romans did because they cared about the Jews or they cared about Jewish customs. They were just sort of trying to keep it together and stave off revolution. So there were definitely allowances that the Romans made for Jewish customs. So there is a pretty big pile of evidence that the body of Jesus was actually at some point at least placed in a tomb, and then somehow it disappeared either through theft or through some other mechanism of disappearance. Now, here's why this is sort of important. Let's say I'm having a dispute with my roommate, and I say to my roommate, I think you stole my guitar. It's a prized possession. I really loved my guitar, and you stole it. And my roommate's response is, I didn't steal your guitar. Somebody else probably stole it. Now, let's say we then go to court, and we go in front of the judge, and the judge says, wait a second, you never even had a guitar. Now, this is a problematic thing for the judge to say, right? I would say, wait a second, we all agree that I had the guitar. Like, my roommate's saying that my guitar was stolen, so that presupposes that I actually had a guitar. And in this case, to extend the analogy, what we have is we have voicemails from my roommate saying that the guitar was stolen. We have text messages from my roommate. We have emails. So there's a lot of evidence saying that the guitar was stolen. So the natural presumption, unless there's evidence to the contrary, is yes, that guitar existed at one point. At one point, that guitar went missing. So again, I just wish that Bart Ehrman would portray this argumentation in a way that's a little more transparent, or at least provides a little bit more room that there's some uncertainty in the historical consensus about what we know about what happened with Jesus' body. Now, I personally believe that there was likely a tomb, at least at some point, that Jesus' body was likely buried for some point in time. I'd be happy to make an entire video about this. I think the historical evidence on this point is actually quite convincing, but maybe this requires its own video. I'd love to talk more about this, so let me know in the comment section if you'd like to hear more about the fact that Jesus' body likely, at least for some length of time in history, had some sort of a tomb. I'm happy to talk more about this. All right, the next claim is claim number 2. So this is the claim that the New Testament is full of forgeries. So Bart Ehrman has made several strong statements criticizing the textual integrity of the New Testament for a lot of different reasons. One of his main criticisms is that there are many forgeries within the New Testament. And this means that he's talking about people who are portraying themselves in a life that's deceitful or dishonest or just lacks integrity. So he's made a couple of strong statements about this. He views this as a very significant moral and ethical indictment of the New Testament, and also an indictment of the veracity of the New Testament itself. And I'll put a couple of comments on the screen that Bart Ehrman has said over the years, saying the New Testament is not a reliable document because it's filled with forgeries. Now, again, I don't personally believe in biblical inerrancy, and I'm not a New Testament scholar. I think there are a lot of things in the New Testament that are at least of doubtful origin. Okay, and there are many more things in the Old Testament that I personally still find problematic, some of which I've not dived into thoroughly. I also have not finished reading the entirety of the New Testament, so there are parts of the New Testament that I haven't even finished reading in their entirety. It's kind of not my area of interest at the particular moment that I'm talking. As I'm doing this video, I'm kind of interested in more criticisms of Jesus from antiquity, and that's been sort of the literature that I've been diving into a lot more. But anyways, Bart Ehrman's portrayal of the New Testament as full of forgeries has been very strongly made. But many historical scholars on all sides of the religious to atheistic spectrum, historical scholars who are Christian, historical scholars who are Catholic, historical scholars who are atheist, who are agnostic. All these scholars have come out and said that Bart Ehrman's contention that the New Testament is filled with forgeries is probably not justified. Now, there's three different reasons why people have taken issue with this characterization. Reason number one is it's anachronistic. So our modern definition of forgeries is just something that didn't exist in the time that the New Testament was likely written. And applying current moral standards to the time of antiquity is probably not entirely appropriate. Number two, this is a very moralistic stance. So essentially what Bart Ehrman is saying is this is a moral indictment of the New Testament. Now, that's an interesting argument, but it really sort of applies a very moral analysis of the New Testament rather than pure textual criticisms, which is really more in what Bart Ehrman's wheelhouse should be. In other words, he's a textual scholar. I think levying a moral criticism is at the very least problematic. The other problem with his perspective is it's often been criticized as overly simplistic. It sort of paints the New Testament authors in a more black and white range. Now, I'm not saying that forgery is a justified thing to do in any time, and definitely currently forgery is a bad thing to do. But in antiquity, in particular during the era that the New Testament was written, there were authors that were writing as part of intellectual, linguistic, and theological traditions that were communicating lessons based on the school of thought that they were in. So in other words, like a lot of historical scholars, you can kind of look at a book that's been written, like the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, and say that you can attribute it to Matthew, or you can attribute it probably more accurately to the community of Matthew, meaning that it was probably different people writing under the intellectual or teaching tradition or theological tradition of this kind of Matthew-based community. So, all right, let's go over some criticisms that various mostly atheistic historical scholars have with characterizing the New Testament as essentially a forgery. So Maurice Casey, who's an agnostic New Testament scholar, he's an expert in Aramaic and early Christianity, he says, in the ancient world, pseudonyms was not necessarily considered deception. Some texts were meant to honor a teacher or continue a tradition and not to trick readers. Anthony Grafton, who's a secular scholar at Princeton University, writes, in antiquity, writing under another's name was often part of the rhetorical and educational culture. Not all works were understood as forgeries. David Ahn, who's a very neutral New Testament scholar, writes, the criteria for authorship in antiquity were fluid. It was common for disciples or followers to write in the name of a revered teacher. And Larry Hurtado, who's a Christian but very moderate, writes, the rhetorical heart Ehrman brings to the subject of forgery often ignores ancient literary practices and cultural norms. So again, this is something where I initially absorbed the argument for Bart Ehrman, and I said, yes, this is a pretty strong indictment of the New Testament. And then later, as I read more, I realized that probably some of Bart Ehrman's contentions are not entirely justified, or at least not being portrayed in a manner that is scrupulous, intellectually honest, transparent, and really depicts the true nuances of the ethical issues surrounding the authorship of the New Testament in a way that's accurate. Now, a lot of these are issues that I'm presenting in a very terse distillation, and that does oversimplify a lot of the things that we're talking about. So if this claim or any other claims that you find in this video you'd like to hear more about, I'd love to do an entire new video about one of these claims and just kind of focus in on a lot of the data, because I do find it really interesting. All right, so let's get to the final claim of this video, the number one claim. Bart Ehrman claims Jesus never professed to be divine. Now, I made a whole video about this, and I hope that you all will check out the other video that I made, because there's a lot of evidence in this. Even in the short time since I made that video, I have uncovered new evidence, new testimony that argues that Jesus did indeed profess to be divine, that he did claim to be divine. So let's just briefly go over some of the evidence, and I'll talk about some of the evidence that I recap in the other video. So there's a lot of evidence that Jesus was considered to be very guilty of heresy, very guilty of being a blasphemer, and specifically of inciting people who were Jews to turn towards a false idol of himself. So now this is verified in the Birkat HaMinim, which is the curse of Mins, I went into depth in my other video about how Jesus was considered a min. In other words, he was considered someone who was encouraging others to turn their attention towards a false idol. So this makes the case that Jesus was essentially a blasphemer in the perspective of the Jews. There's a mountain of evidence that supports this claim. Now, here's the real problem, though. From an ethical perspective, Bart Ehrman only cites the New Testament. He doesn't cite any of the early Jewish literature. He doesn't cite any of the Roman or pagan critics. And if you look at any of the Jewish literature, any of the Roman or pagan critics, that all goes towards the side that Jesus likely claimed to be divine. So my problem isn't that Bart Ehrman is making this claim about the New Testament. It's that he's making this claim based on an appeal to authority. And the appeal to authority that he uses is definitely his own authority. So this becomes problematic when you try to look at the life of Jesus through a much wider lens, which includes the early Jewish disputations of Jesus and also the Roman and pagan critics. I'll just briefly go over some of the evidence and some of the analysis that Jesus claimed to be divine. So one of the examples is all 8 versions of the Toledot Yeshu claim that Jesus claimed to be divine. Celsus was an early critic of Jesus who also agreed that Jesus claimed to be divine. You have statements by Lucian, you have statements by Porphyry, you have statements by other critics of Jesus. So I'll put some quotes on the screen, and I won't go over all the evidence because I do go into a lot of this evidence in the other video. So, okay, what I'm saying is if you look at a wider lens of what people were saying about Jesus in antiquity, many people were saying that Jesus claimed to be divine. And this is a statement that you hear echoed by a lot of different folks. But in addition to that, some people responded to some of the other videos that I made saying that, no, these are responses to the Christians. They're not responses to Jesus directly. So I do want to address that briefly. So, again, the Toledot Yeshu uses very exculpatory language towards Paul. They call him Saul of Tarsus. But they say that Paul didn't do anything wrong. Paul was enticed to false idolatry by Jesus. So again, this ire is not directed towards the early Christians. It is instead directed directly at Jesus. So when you read the Jewish literature, especially when you read it in the full constellation and in its context, which I encourage you to do, you see that Jesus did indeed make the claim that he was divine. Moreover, from a common sense perspective, if you read any of the Jewish disputation about Jesus, you very quickly come to the conclusion that there was a lot of very acerbic hatred towards the Jews, towards Jesus. Phrases that get used in the Jewish literature include, may his bones be ground to dust, may his name be erased from history. And that degree of hatred is sort of hard to reconcile if you only consider Jesus as a political leader. In other words, if you only look at Jesus as a political leader and you don't consider Jesus theologically, which is the case that Bart Ehrman makes, that Jesus was a political figure, that he was not a figure of any theological consequence, that he never claimed to be divine, then it becomes very difficult to explain the degree to which the Jewish hatred is very acerbic towards Jesus. Now, before I close this argument off, I just want to say that no one should take anything in this video as a statement against the Jews. Sometimes people have historically used the Toledot Yeshu as an indictment of Judaism and indictment of the Jewish response towards Jesus. I think, anti-Semitism is absolutely wrong. That bigotry has no place in this discussion. So I don't want anyone to take anything in this video out of context or use anything in this video as justification for anti-Semitism. That's horrific, and I would totally disavow anyone taking that interpretation. But again, Bart Ehrman portrays in very black and white terms that absolutely Jesus never claimed to be divine. And more problematically, Bart Ehrman uses as his support for this claim only the New Testament, kind of ignoring everything else that the Jews said, everything else that the Romans and pagans said. I think this is not an intellectually honest or scrupulous characterization of all the statements that were made on this issue. I think at the very least, Bart Ehrman should be more transparent and more academically honest, and if he thinks that all the Jewish and Roman and pagan writings about Jesus' claim of divinity are invalid, then that's an argument that he should really spell out. And to date, he hasn't done so. To date, the arguments of Bart Ehrman have not really acknowledged any of the other critics of Jesus. So I consider that to be a very big gap in Ehrman's analysis. All right, I'm going to stop the video there. but I really appreciate you all tuning in. I really appreciate the support. Before I close out entirely, I do just want to address briefly what my perspective is. So I actually started my journey of learning about the historical Jesus by absorbing the lectures of Richard Carrier. So you can talk to a lot of people who know me. As of 4 or 5 years ago, I was making the case that there was never any historical Jesus, that the historical Jesus never existed, that Jesus was entirely mythological, because those were the lecture materials that I was absorbing at the time. Then I turned to Bart Ehrman, and I realized that Jesus was an actual historical figure, but that the New Testament was flawed. Now I'm sort of moving more towards a much more balanced perspective. And as I've engaged in these transitions, it's become apparent to me that people who lecture on this topic portray a very one-sided perspective of this debate. So I would just, again, encourage you, don't decide anything based on what I say. Do your own research. But when it comes to making theological, moral, and spiritual decisions about your own life and your own trajectory, you should not base them on Bart Ehrman. You should not base them on Richard Carrier. You shouldn't even base them on me. What you should base those decisions on should be a fair, impartial, balanced perspective of the data. And you probably will not get that from any one individual historical scholar. I think, unfortunately, you have to draw your literature from several sources. Now, you should know that my field of scholarship, my field of academic publications, I've published more than 50 peer-reviewed papers. I'm an editor and a reviewer for the top journal in my field, and I've reviewed hundreds of other manuscripts. So in my field, when you make a definitive statement, it really has to be supported by a lot of evidence. So in other words, you won't find people in my field making statements that are based on very limited views or very limited perspectives of the evidence that exists. Unfortunately, I find with New Testament scholarship, that's just the way it is. People make statements that are, I think, a little bit flawed, a little less academically rigorous, and a little more unscrupulous. And that is the main reason why I'm criticizing Bart Ehrman. It's just to criticize the state of the literature right now. So I hope no one takes this as any kind of personal dislike that I have for Bart Ehrman. I respect him quite a bit as a scholar. I spend a lot of time looking at his videos, watching his lectures. I think a lot of things that he says are very insightful and are very historically well informed. But some of the conclusions that he makes are worded too strongly, and they're just not supported by the literature and the state of our current cultural, anthropological, and archaeological knowledge about first century Judea. All right, so that really concludes this video. I'm super grateful for the support. I really appreciate the folks who are tuning in. Thanks so much for liking the video. Thanks so much for checking out all our materials. Please feel free to like the channel, subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon for notifications so you don't miss out on future videos. And definitely, 100%, maybe most importantly, keep the comments coming, because I really love the discussion, and engaging with your comments has been one of my favorite parts of making this video. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and as always, have a really great, wonderful, and absolutely lovely day. Thanks.